Ladies, gentlemen, scholars, countrymen,
friends, students, juvenile delinquents,
and children of all the ages, the time has come to continue this series. We've made it to help me, Nigel, from the hit movie Finding Nemo. What part are we on again?
3.
3, that's right. Part 3 of reviewing all the cartoons from MGM's repertoire. And hopefully we're gonna have some fun along the way. I mean, what's not to love about blackface, economics lectures, and women drivers jokes?
That's bait.
Anyway, there are plenty of cartoons that I'm sure you're just as anxious to hear about as I am anxious to talk about, so I'm not going to keep you waiting too much longer. However, I do want to express a quick acknowledgement to the Blogspot website Trowfaz. This is the video where we will be talking about the John Sutherland cartoons, and I could not find any consistent information as to when exactly these cartoons in particular were released. Wikipedia, the MGM Wiki, IMDb, and Letterboxd were all giving me very different dates, if they even gave me a date at all. And this was the only web page where all the release dates for the 7 cartoons are included at once. The author of this page goes by the name Don M. Yaup, and he claims he found these dates by looking at trade publications, and I have no reason to think otherwise. So, he did all the legwork there, he gets all the credit for that, and a link to the page should be in the description below if you want to take a look, and if it's not, please let me know so that I can correct that. And as always, before we get started, a quick thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, and a special shout out to my newest patrons, Cool Blue, Delta W, Elijah McNish, Matt0417, Nick J, Sergey Ushakov, and William Clark. Thank you guys so much for your support. And if you enjoy the content I make and would like to offer your support, then for as little as $1 a month, you can get your name listed right here at the start of every video. Link to that is in the description below. Anyway, let's waste no more time. Let's just dive right in. Saltwater Tabby. Here we have yet another example of Jerry being kind of a... Let's see, how do I say this and keep this G-rated? Troublemaker. He's just going through some random female cat's picnic basket and not only eating her food, but also throwing the food he's not going to eat out onto the sand. Although Tom's honestly not much better. Seriously, did he think that eating her wiener was going to win her over? I mean, maybe if it was a clam. Nope, come on, you're a grown adult. You're more mature than this. Keep it clean. Anyway, despite the plot that feels rather scattershot, for example, at one point Tom is shown being on good terms with the female cat without any segue or explanation, the slapstick still manages to be pretty good, particularly when it comes to the abuse inflicted on Tom's tail by a crab. In order to be truly great, there either needed to be a more cogent plot or less plot, period, because this kind of half and half approach in this cartoon isn't the strongest way to tackle this. Uncle Tom's Cabana. Tex Avery decided that his tackling of Uncle Tom's cabin from 10 years ago, Uncle Tom's Bungalow, wasn't enough. He decided that he absolutely had to give this material a second go-round. And MGM, being so kind and generous, didn't see anything wrong with that whatsoever. Okay, in all seriousness, this is one that I'm really torn on. And believe it or not, it has nothing to do with the blackface. It has to do with the actual composition. So we have Uncle Tom telling a story to some youngins on what seems to be a typical plantation circa 1800s, but said story is in a modern, updated New York City, for some reason. So first it decides to tell a milk and money type of story, where Uncle Tom has to find some money to pay the mortgage or else get kicked out, but then once Eva enters the picture, they just decide to turn the cabin into a nightclub. So then, when Simon Legree goes down there to steal the money, he ties up Uncle Tom, but then gets sidetracked by little Eva performing, and he decides to recreate Red Hot Riding Hood for a little bit. But then Uncle Tom tries to stop him, and then the cartoon just completely gives up trying to have any semblance of structure, and just becomes a frenzied chase cartoon of quick gags with little to no relation to each other. The cartoon is just so wild and anarchic, but without really a proper through line. But then again, you could make the argument that that's the point, because the framing device is that Uncle Tom is telling the story and making it up as he goes along. But then at the same time, I don't exactly know for what purpose. Yeah, as you probably guessed, this plot is a mess. I don't know exactly what Tex Avery was trying to accomplish here. Like, updating this story to modern times could make for some interesting commentary about how the corporate fat cats treat their workers or tenants or those beneath them as no better than chattel. But this cartoon doesn't do anything with updating the setting beyond doing what Tex Avery's already done before. But with that said, even if the cartoon as a whole feels heavily disjointed and fractured, there's still some really good pieces in here. Great character animation, facial expressions, funny puns, and some clever moments. Like how Uncle Tom manages to snuff out the wick on the dynamite he's tied to from his excessive sweating. There are great elements in here as you would expect, it just doesn't coagulate into a solid package. A Mouse in the House. So, yeah, for those of you saying that Mamie Two Shoes is only the live-in maid and is not Tom's actual owner, I mean, she literally claims that Jerry's been in her bread box. Not the bread box, her bread box. Anyway, this is another fun rivalry cartoon of two cats fighting over Jerry. The slapstick's pretty good, and I love the bit of Jerry helping both Tom and Butch look for him. There's a couple of odd moments, like, it was a little bit unclear as to why Tom thought the gun that Butch was holding here was just a novelty gun. Like, sure, the gun he had been holding was a toy gun, but it said Ajax Novelty Gun on it. The handle on Butch's gun just says Ajax. If the label didn't say that it was a novelty gun, then why did you think that it was one? And the final punchline it's building to is a bit predictable, but it's handled very well, thanks in part to Lillian Randolph's hilarious line delivery. But overall, minor hiccups aside, this is a good, solid outing that doesn't reinvent anything, but that's not always necessary. Slap Happy Lion. This is the second Tex Avery cartoon in a row in which he uses a completely unnecessary framing device to tell the story. You're not doing Pulp Fiction here, just tell some silly jokes. But once the story does get rolling, it's got a few great gags and reactions. Standout moment here is the bit of the ostrich putting his head in the sand, grass, and then lifting the patch of land out of the ground so that he can run away. Nothing brilliant, but it's fun for what it is. The Invisible Mouse. So quickly after Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Mouse, they're already back to doing a science fiction type story again. They don't even go with anything complicated to explain the invisibility. It's just, there's some invisible ink laying around. That is just so creatively lazy that I love it. Anyway, the creators take full advantage of the setup, both as a showcase for some fun animation, including this incredible shot of using shadow work to reveal Jerry, and in just all the ways that Jerry torments Tom. My favorite bit being the moment where Jerry frames Tom for him hitting Spike over the head with a driver. There's also this really clever homage to the climax to The Invisible Man. All in all, just a fun and classic cartoon. King Size Canary. Let's see. Opposing forces keep trying to make themselves a bigger and bigger weapon in a desperate attempt to try to one-up their sworn enemy, but with both of them having access to the same material, and all it does is lead to them growing to dangerous levels with nothing truly being accomplished, except a lot of close calls that could have been absolutely catastrophic for the whole world? Where have I heard that before? In all seriousness, it cannot be a coincidence that this cartoon came out the exact same year that the Cold War began, right? I mean, I know the US-Soviet Union arms race hadn't technically started yet. They were still 2 years out from it. But still, could this be considered one of the first pieces of media that actually satirized it, even if prophetically? The dog's name is even called Adam. I mean, come on! Anyway, historical context notwithstanding, this still stands as one really great cartoon and another Tex Avery classic. Lots of great reactions, puns, fourth wall breaks, voice work, great use of its setting and premise, you name it, it's in here. My only real complaint is the ending, which seems to be building and building to a climax, but then it just kinda stops. Still, the rest of this is sharp and funny, although I'm not sure I would have personally put this near the number 10 slot on the 50 greatest cartoons of all time list. The Bear and the Bean. Now they've tossed Barney Bear, after a 3-year-long hibernation, over to the likes of Michael Law and Preston Blair, 2 of Tex Avery's animators. Apparently MGM was dead set on getting a 3rd animation crew beyond the Hanna-Barbera and Avery teams. Of course, the big issue is that anybody is going to have to suffer in comparison to the two. But even taking it on its own merits, this is not great. Like, this is at best totally passable, but it doesn't even come close to being as funny or as energetic as it needs to. Especially when you have a premise that involves a Mexican jumping bean. You could really do so much with that, but instead this just feels customary. No surprises, no great reactions, nothing extra. This just feels like a student turning in an assignment with the absolute bare minimum effort required. It functions but won't leave the slightest impact. Make Mine Freedom. And now we're getting into the first of the 7 John Sutherland produced cartoons. Back in 1947, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation contacted Harding University to make some cartoons that promoted the American way of life and showed why free market capitalism was the best economic philosophy, especially in comparison to communism. And while these cartoons were not made by MGM, they were distributed by them, so I decided, you know what, I might as well include them here. In that way, these cartoons bear a striking resemblance to the Warner Brothers cartoons By Word of Mouse, Air Conditioned, and Yankee Doodle It, which was also co-produced by the Sloan Foundation. But those felt more like actual cartoons with an economics lesson kinda thrown in. This is an economics lesson with a little bit of cartoon thrown in. But in a strange way, I almost admire this one more for that. It doesn't even try to hide what this is, an anti-collectivist propaganda cartoon. Now, of course, your tolerance for it will depend on whether or not you agree with the message or find the argument at all compelling. I personally happen to mostly agree with the message, although it is presented perhaps a bit too surface level. Although I guess I shouldn't have expected F.A. Hayek levels of depth in a cartoon. And it doesn't really go after the actual arguments that people make in favor of communism, but rather a straw man of it. Like, pro-communists don't come right out and say that they want communism in order to restrict freedom, but rather that we should all work together for the common good, or say that they want to promote equality. If you want to actually argue against Marxism, then you have to understand and communicate the actual Marxist ideas. Attacking a straw man doesn't actually accomplish anything except make you feel good in the moment if you happen to agree with it. Although this part in particular about the communist government seizing the farmers' crops seems like a thinly veiled reference to Holodomor. As for the actual cartoon itself, its presentation is solid enough. Some of the gags work, some of them don't, some of the imagery works, and some of the imagery doesn't work. It's a mixed bag, but ultimately it is worth at least one viewing, if for no other reason to understand what the American sentiment was towards capitalism and the view towards communists at the time. What Priced Fleedom? Tex Avery has another go at the flea on the dog plot. Only this time it adds the flea chasing after a female flea, and also adds a dog that is not only tolerant of Homer Flea, but is actually sad and heartbroken that he left him. Like, so heartbroken that he's willing to blow himself to smithereens, blow his brains out, and hang himself at the same time over the prospect that he might never see his friend again. Seems a bit overkill to me. Both of these twists of the formula do add some much needed energy. There's nothing truly outstanding here, and the ending punchline doesn't feel well thought out, but it's a fun little bit of Tex Avery chaos. Kitty Foiled. This one's a mostly standard Tom and Jerry chase cartoon, only they add a silent canary to the mix. Thankfully, standard Tom and Jerry at this stage is still very, very good. It doesn't really shake up the formula too much, but it does have its fair share of great moments, most notably the bit where Jerry smashes Tom's teeth with a hammer. I love how Tom just has this look on his face like, wait, what's he gonna do with that? Little Tinker. Remember how I said I wasn't a big fan of those poor little me pity party cartoons? Well, it turns out there's an exception to that rule, and it's when Tex Avery's the one in the director's chair. It helps that there's a lot more going on here than in those kinds of cartoons. The setup is used as a catalyst to tell jokes, not tell a story. Actually, if anything, the majority of this cartoon seems perfectly content in being one of those Frank Sinatra takedowns that were so prevalent in cartoons during this era. Not only does it allow for some pretty funny jokes about Frank Sinatra being too thin for his own good, which I thought was a unique spin on an old gag, but it gives Avery the opportunity to do more of his infamous wild takes, this time with female bunnies. Not necessarily a laugh riot, but it's creative, clever, and cute. The Bear and the Hare. This Barney Bear cartoon is a slight improvement over the last one. They still can't get the slapstick timing quite right, but the premise of this one is a lot better. The setup is simple, but allows for some creative gags that you couldn't get in any other chase cartoon. This one is on the upper side of, yeah, it's fine. The Truce Hurts. Here's another classic one that I grew up with as a kid. It's funny, you'd think that with a premise centered around the idea of a truce between Tom and Jerry and Spike, or Butch as he's called in this cartoon, that there wouldn't be any laughs to be found here. But that's just simply not the case. The situation is kind of funny in and of itself. Just seeing the sheer lengths that they go to try to be nice to each other is presented in such a way as if it's slyly mocking the cartoons that are overly sentimental. Kind of like how Tom pushes Jerry's chair into place, and then Spike pushes Tom's chair into place, but then Tom and Jerry both push Spike's chair into place. But of course, in order for them to do that, that meant they had to get out of their chairs that they had just been politely put into in order to do that. And not only that, but the reactions of the other characters seeing the truce play out produces some fantastic reactions, punctuated by some incredible sound effects. And of course, this still manages to work in some great slapstick. Some of Tom and Jerry's best slapstick they've had in a minute. And by the end, the trio all learn two very important lessons. Don't stand so close to mud or else you might accidentally do your best Justin Trudeau impression. And when it comes to sharing meat, there are no friends. Messages that I'm sure you'll find plenty of application for in your normal everyday life. All kidding aside, this is great. It's funny, focuses on every element just as long as it needs to, and finds a way to have a sense of both likability and cruelty about itself without feeling inconsistent. Half Pint Pygmy. So they decided to give George and Jr. a redesign, only for this to be their final cartoon? Yeah, that makes sense. This cartoon is Tex Avery just giving the middle finger to those pesky little things like structure, consistency, and setup and payoff. This cartoon is more or less just all high-octane energy. It's like the Rodney Dangerfield of cartoons. All punchlines, very little setup. It never takes a second to cool down and rest, even when it probably should. And in a strange way, I just have to admire it for it. Also, this is the second time in a row that Tex Avery has ended a character's run with their deaths at the very end of the cartoon. I'm starting to notice a pattern here. Old Rockin' Chair Tom. Another absolute Tom and Jerry banger. The opening puts the pedal to the metal right from the get-go, with Jerry needlessly and cruelly taunting Mammy Two Shoes for seemingly no reason other than because he thinks it's funny. And there are so many wonderful little moments sprinkled throughout, like Jerry trying to chop down the stool Mammy Two Shoes is on with an axe of all things, Tom getting dressed up as Uncle Tom, surprised it took them that long to make that joke if I'm being completely honest, and Lightning framing Tom for raiding the icebox. The way Lightning tries to make himself look all saintly and innocent, and even moving Tom's head up and down in an affirmative yes to being asked if he's the one who raided the icebox is just, man, that is really funny stuff. Not to mention, I do enjoy those cartoons where Tom and Jerry do have to fight against a common enemy, and this is probably the best example of that to date. Not only because the jokes in this are really, really funny, but also because, unlike in something like Dog Trouble or The Lonesome Mouse, here the truce actually seems more permanent. Yeah, we love to see Tom and Jerry fight and chase after each other, but in a series like this where there is no set continuity, I think it's fine to have certain cartoons end with the two of them on a good note if the plot calls for it. And I think it absolutely does here. It's a nice little cherry on top of what was already a pretty great cartoon. Lucky Ducky. Unhinged Tex Avery is the best kind of Tex Avery. Here, he doesn't even bother with dialogue or characters to set up the situation. It's just go, go, go from the outset and just doesn't let up for 1 second. So many wonderful moments here, like the ducks doing a conga line mocking the hunters before they're allowed to actually shoot them, to the school crossing gag. Literally, this thing is just jam-packed with jokes. They probably play the duck quacking sound effect a few too many times, but other than that, this is a classic in one of Tex Avery's most underrated cartoons. Going Places. The second of the John Sutherland pro-capitalist propaganda cartoons, and this one, I'm assuming, was significantly less successful than the first one. I say that because I can't find any sources, primary or secondary, that give a release date for it. Anyway, this one puts an emphasis on the importance of work while sneaking in some information about the effects of competition, monopolies, the increased standard of living, and profit motive. But I feel like there are also better ways to convey all this information in such a way so that it's not so dry. At least Make Mine Freedom managed to work in some good old-fashioned patriotism to try to rouse the populace. This one's honestly kinda dull. I don't think this one would be that persuasive to people that didn't already agree with its message. I just remember in The Hudsucker Proxy how that film managed to explain the concept of supply and demand visually and in an entertaining way, and that's stuck with me all these years. I'm not going to remember any of the iconography in this one. Like, I guess this would be fine if you wanted to show it in an economics class or something, and there's occasionally an amusing moment here and there, but honestly, if you wanted to sit through an animated economics lesson with a few jokes thrown in, there are better options out there. Professor Tom. Tom tries to teach his nephew, I guess, that cats and mice are mortal enemies and that no matter what, they can never ever get along or associate with each other. I guess it's true what they say. Racism really is learned behavior. Anyway, this one's a pleasant enough experience. Maybe tries to be a little bit cutesier than normal, perhaps due to the addition of the kitten character, but that doesn't mean this doesn't have its fair share of mean moments sprinkled throughout. Probably my favorite is the bit with the vase. If for no other reason, the timing for it was simply impeccable. Fairly routine, but as I've said before, routine Tom and Jerry is still rather good. The Cat That Hated People. Well, this one certainly lives up to the title. This is about a cat that does indeed hate people. In fact, he hates people so much that he rants and raves about how there's always too many people around and how he just wants to get away from all the people. Typical introvert. Anyway, this is about what you'd expect from Tex Avery by this point, in that we don't know what to expect from his cartoons. Wild manic energy, visual gags, and throwing so much at the wall just trying to get a laugh. And this is a pretty funny one, even if the gags on the moon feel like they're trying to copy Porky and Wacky Land just a bit too much. Standout moment by far is the bit where the dog frames the cat for literal murder by covering himself in ketchup and putting the axe in the cat's hand. That's a hilariously macabre image. Mouse Cleaning. This is the first of two banned Tom and Jerry cartoons, and the lesser known of the two. This one was likely added to the chopping block due to the ending gag of Tom trying to escape Mammy Two Shoes' wrath by disguising himself as a stereotypical black man via blackface. Because it comes with the resolution, it wasn't something that could just be edited out without the cartoon not really making any sense. And honestly, it is kind of a shame that this one is mostly forgotten about because this is a really, really solid outing from this duo. This is basically an updated version of Tom and Jerry's first cartoon, Puss Gets the Boot. And given the formula has become more perfected by this time compared to where they originally were, it does make sense for them to do an updated telling of their OG plot. And this is probably one of Jerry's more sadistic offerings, showing absolutely zero mercy to Tom and taking delightful glee in making him really suffer. Honestly, in terms of just raw reactions from the characters, speed, and sadism, and you add on top of that some of the funniest vocal reactions from Lillian Randolph, this one's a hoot. Goggle Fishing Bear. The final Barney Bear cartoon supervised by Preston Blair and Michael Law, and his last one for 3 years before he was handed over to Dick Lundy. But we'll get to those when we get to those. Right now, let's focus on this one. There's honestly not much to say here. It's perfectly competent for what it is. The seal is kinda cute and has a good design, and there's a few decent moments here and there, like Barney running through the shark's teeth or the seal bailing out the boat while it's underwater. It's not really funny, but it's pleasant enough, and really, sometimes that's all you need. Bad Luck Blackie. Tex Avery kicks this one off with an almost identical framing of the opening of Puss Gets the Boot, so you might be fooled into thinking that this is going to be a Tom and Jerry style cartoon, just with a dog and kitten in the eponymous roles. And to an extent, it kind of is, in the sense that the setup could be used in a Tom and Jerry cartoon. In fact, the plot itself is very similar to the premise of The Bodyguard. But this cartoon is perhaps the greatest testament to the differences between Avery's sense of humor and that of Hanna-Barbera. They were more about the build-up to an explosion of violence with character moments in between. Tex Avery was all about fast-paced freneticism, tossing every possible thing he could think of at the viewer as far as he could without overwhelming them. The plot and characters aren't really the point. The gags are what's the point. And thankfully, this one delivers on that front. Creative, fast-moving, full of near non-stop energy. This is another one of those cartoons where you give Avery one great joke, and he'll manage to make the same joke funny about a dozen times in a row. Meet King Joe. An average Joe named, Joe, learns a very important lesson that you would have already learned by now if you'd paid attention to the first two of these Harding College cartoons, which is that the American capitalist way is good and leads to a richer economy, and with more leisure time than any other time in human history. Only this time there's a Chinese stereotype thrown into the mix, because that's what was missing from the first two. Also, the gags here take a huge back seat to the educational stuff, which honestly makes this a pretty dry experience, which is especially detrimental here because, we've heard these talking points before. In fact, Going Places covers more economic talking points and with better jokes, so why wouldn't I just watch that one instead? Polka Dot Puss. Another particularly sadistic outing from Tom and Jerry, with Jerry in particular going above and beyond to make Tom suffer here. I swear, I actually think Jerry's trying to kill him this time around. And the fact that he's doing this all the while pretending that he's trying to help Tom out of the goodness of his own heart honestly makes it all the crueler. And not surprisingly, this is one of the few outings that ends with Tom and Jerry both losing. Some might think this one goes a little bit too far with its mean-spiritedness, but I still think it's pretty funny. Senor Droopy. Well, it looks like they finally settled on a name for the dog from Dumbhounded, and plans were made to make said dog into a more reoccurring character after George and Jr. didn't work out. And as you would expect, this is a mighty good one. Lots of great high-energy gags, overreactions from the wolf, underreactions from Droopy, and some great line reads courtesy of Bill Thompson. And I also like how the petty act of the bull drawing a fake mustache on Lena Romay's picture is what finally gives Droopy the strength to beat the tar out of him. That, plus the ending gag, really solidifies this as yet another great cartoon from Tex Avery. The Little Orphan. This is basically a repeat of The Milky Waif, except most of this is actually focused on Jerry trying to find Nibbles something to eat on a Thanksgiving dinner. Tom doesn't really factor in until the last 3 minutes. But man, do they take advantage of every second they have with him when he does show up. These feature some of the absolute funniest slugs against Tom ever committed to film, with some of the best smug, overconfident facial expressions that we just can't wait to see get smacked right off his puss. If he'd been in it just a little bit more and the slapstick up to par with the last third, I think this would have been seen as one of their finest cartoons. The rest of it is cute and does have some great animation on the food that really does look delicious, but man, you have to stick around for that final fight. Also, I do have to ask, is this bit of Tom's face turning red while wearing Indian attire supposed to be a deliberate reference to him being a redskin, or was that pure happenstance? I kind of feel like if it was deliberate, it would have been more caricaturized, but at the same time, how could they not have seen that pun? Hatch Up Your Troubles. You've got to give Jerry credit. Every time a little foundling or orphan or lost child comes across his way, he makes sure to take real good care of them in a paternalistic way. Even in this case, where the baby woodpecker is literally destroying his home. And much like the previous The Little Orphan, Tom doesn't really get much stage presence here. This time not even making an appearance until the last 3 minutes. Instead, it kinda sets up this conflict of Jerry finally having had enough of the baby woodpecker and kicks him out of his hidey hole. But then, that ultimately doesn't go anywhere. So why is it here? But anyway, once the slapstick fight against Tom and Jerry and the Woodpecker gets rolling, it's got a lot of great bits as you would expect. I just wish that more time had been devoted to it. The House of Tomorrow. Tex Avery returns to his more Warner Brothers style roots by doing another one of his travelogue, or I guess infomercial in this case, parodies. Definitely not some of his finest work, but it's a perfectly fine outing regardless. Some parts feel a little bit like Tex Avery on autopilot, but even on autopilot, he's still able to produce some good solid laughs. Also, as everyone else has already pointed out, this is the cartoon in which he more or less predicted the internet, with the futuristic machine that has the capability to answer any question that you may have, but of course will bite back and bully you if you ask it the wrong question. At least it didn't try to convince the kid to game end himself. Also, man, somebody on the crew must have really hated his mother-in-law, given how savage some of these jokes are. I could just imagine Tex Avery having to be forced to explain to his own mother-in-law that he obviously wasn't talking about her with these jokes. Heavenly Puss. Also known as the one cartoon that traumatized any child who happened to watch it for life. No, not the one Tom and Jerry cartoon, the one cartoon they watched, period. Man, where do I even begin with this one? Let's start with the obvious. This cartoon is very different from your typical Tom and Jerry fare. Sure, it starts off like it's going to be normal, with the typical chase elements and all that, but then the audience is thrown for a loop where instead of getting right back up after Tom endures one of his slapstick antics, he dies. His soul leaves his body and he heads up on an escalator up to the pearly gates. And right away, you can just feel this incredible weight and atmosphere to what's going on. There's this slowness and softness as Tom is lifted heavenward, almost as if he, like the audience, is in a state of shock and is slowly accepting that he has, in fact, passed away. It's a surprisingly sobering moment, and it's a very quiet moment, and it really takes its time letting it all really sink in and soak you in its elegance and ambiance. And then after Tom tries to sneak past the gatekeeper, which is a great detail in and of itself, it means that Tom himself was already aware that he wasn't worthy of making it onto the Heavenly Express, that he felt that he needed to try to sneak past the guard. And Tom learns that if he doesn't seek and receive Jerry's forgiveness within the hour, then he is going to be tossed right into hell. And this thing doesn't sugarcoat it. We see the whole kit and caboodle. The red devil dog with the pitchfork, the fire and brimstone. They don't leave any ambiguity as to what's going to happen to him if he doesn't succeed at this. This is some really shocking imagery, particularly the bit of Tom actually getting stabbed by the pitchfork. And the rest of the cartoon is just Tom trying to convince Jerry to forgive him in a race against the clock, and not doing a very good job at that, which is where a lot of the comedy comes in. What I think makes this cartoon so special is that most people don't exactly know how they should feel about this. Are you supposed to find the scenario funny, sad, spiritual, macabre, intense, horrifying? And what other Tom and Jerry cartoon, or heck, how many other pieces of media, period, can instill this wide range of conflicting emotions within an audience, and in such a short runtime to boot? Like, take the moment where Jerry rips up the paper. I could see someone finding that absolutely terrifying, and another person finding that hilarious. This cartoon is just a masterpiece of tone. It weaves through this setup so artfully and so seamlessly that it doesn't feel jarring when it goes from something funny to something menacing. And I think the visuals go a long way with that. The backgrounds in this, particularly that of the Heavenly Realm, are just stunning and gorgeous, and they leave an imprint, or I guess scar in some cases. I remembered how this one looked vividly from my childhood despite not having seen it for years. And then the reveal that this entire thing was a dream from Tom kinda adds another layer on top of all this, as you wonder why exactly he had that nightmare. Was it some underlying guilt he had for how he treated Jerry, a vision warning him to change his ways, or just an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato? And I feel like I haven't even scratched the surface with this one. Like the infamous bit showing the bag of drowned kittens entering the pearly gates, which yes, was a real practice on farms at the time, or how this absolutely nails Tom's sheer desperation at trying to get that one slip of paper signed, or how something as simple as Jerry not being able to get a pen working could be seen as one of the cruelest things that's ever been inflicted on Tom. But this thing really is just so jam-packed with wonderful moments, filled with so much character, atmosphere, a masterpiece of shifting tone, and unremitting cruelty. Heavenly Puss easily stands out as not just one of the Tom and Jerry or even MGM greats, but one of the all-time cartoon greats. Doggone tired. This is like one of those typical main character is trying to get to sleep but everything around him is keeping him awake cartoons. Except if there was some kind of external force actively working to keep the character from getting a good night's sleep. I'm not entirely sure how the hunter was able to sleep through all the ruckus, but I suppose that's one of the things that you're not supposed to think about. Anyway, this one's perfectly average. Most of it is primarily what you would expect with a few standout moments. It kind of feels like, aside from a handful of gags, almost like anybody could have directed this, but even if this isn't up there with Avery's best work, this is still perfectly sufficient. Wags to riches. Tex Avery does his own version of Do-Re-Mi-Ow, only this time with Droopy in the Heathcliff role. Is it as great as that near masterpiece? Not quite, but this is still quite the fun time. I think having the victim of said murder attempts being completely unaware of what the other is trying to do makes the premise funnier, but at the same time, this is a setup that's very much worthy of being in a Droopy cartoon, and it makes it different enough from the other that they can both coexist. The Cat and the Mermouse. Aside from the extremely contentious Baby Puss from a few years back, this is perhaps the first real sign of a chink in the armor for Tom and Jerry. That's not to say it's bad, this is still a perfectly serviceable, watchable cartoon, but this one has obligation cartoon written all over it. It's just kind of a typical Tom chases Jerry setup, except it takes place at the bottom of the sea, and Jerry is a mermouse. I'm not sure what exactly is supposed to be interesting about that. It's not offering anything that fresh or new, the location's not really that exciting either, and aside from this one eardrum gag, the slapstick isn't all that inventive either. Little Rural Riding Hood, the final entry in Tex Avery's Wolfie Drools Over Red cartoons, which I think just goes to show that the man does know when a gag has fully run its course. I think you can make the argument it's a bit of a retread, but at the same time, it does truncate it so it doesn't waste much time on the exposition and setup. It's not quite as unhinged as the previous entries, which is its lone weakness, but that doesn't mean this thing isn't chock full of the same wild, energized reactions that made the original so much fun. Love That Pup. Aw, that Tyke character, he's just so adorable. I think there's an argument you could make that this is a rehash of both Quiet Please and Puttin' on the Dog, but honestly, given just how strong this material is, it's hard to argue that this doesn't make an identity all on its own. Probably my favorite moment is the bit where Spike comforts Tom thinking that he's his boy, and once Tyke actually shows up, Tom keeps desperately trying to convince Spike that he is in fact his boy. There is just something so inherently funny about characters that know their goose is cooked and yet keep trying to convince them otherwise. And of course, the final gag is a riot too. From the excellent build-up to the explosion of violence that we know is coming, and the hilarious payoff that follows. Jerry's Diary. Well, it's that time again.
To encourage children to send us candy?
Why would you... Okay, no. It's clip show time. I guess we've reached the point where either to save money or to fill a slot in a schedule, MGM decided to reuse clips from older, already completed cartoons using a framing device to tie them together. Now, to be absolutely fair, this is not the worst framing device I've ever seen. It's Be Kind to Animals Week, which convinces Tom to try to be nice to Jerry for once, which is kind of confusing since Tom is also an animal, but whatever. But as Tom decides to read Jerry's diary and gets reminded of all the things that Jerry did to him, he gets angrier and angrier, which I guess is kind of interesting in and of itself to try to imagine what exactly their relationship is like in this cartoon, wherein all of these other clips could conceivably exist in the same universe. But with all that being said, it can't disguise the fact that this is what it is, a clip show to try to save money. I'm not exactly sure what the point is, since they were reissuing older Tom and Jerry cartoons in theaters by this time, but I wasn't the one behind the scenes making these decisions back then. There's enough amusing moments in the framing device to make it worth at least one viewing, but it's hard to get past its central problem. Outfoxed. This is Tex Avery doing a retelling of his older Of Fox and Hounds, although this time with Droopy as one of the hounds, and done in his more modern, high-energy style. There's nothing especially new or fresh here, and the ending is more weird and abrupt than funny, but overall, it's fun. The only thing to really note here is that at one point, the posh, stuffy Fox is seen reading a paper called Fox News. Wait a second. Fox News never put out a newspaper. That's fake news. Tennis Chumps. Another absolute classic from my childhood that holds up extremely well. Reverts back to that time-honored tradition of just putting Tom and Jerry into a scenario and letting the gags write themselves. Minimal setup and exposition, and just gets into the slapstick from the get-go and doesn't let up. I just remember this one so vividly, and the gags still make me laugh even to this day. Nostalgia might be playing a slight role in me rating it this high, but I can't help what I grew up with, and I still think this is high-energy Tom and Jerry done extraordinarily well. The Counterfeit Cat. Tex Avery shamelessly tries to rip off the Sylvester and Tweety formula, up to even naming the bird Tweety Bird. The end result is that this is decidedly tame for a Tex Avery outing up to this point, putting a bit of break to the energy in favor of typical chase shenanigans. The only thing this does to try to differentiate itself is that the focus is primarily put on the cat trying to trick the dog that's supposed to be guarding the canary. This isn't his most inspired work by any stretch of the imagination, but it's still fine. He's still a master at what he does, even if he's not utilizing his own strengths to his advantage. And yeah, that's it for the 1940s, an era that was defined by some real classics. Can the 1950s even compete with the previous decade? Only one way to find out. Little Quacker, another absolute banger from my childhood. Here's a fun fact, if you put all the Tom and Jerry cartoons that I said I grew up with, you can actually figure out which VHS tape I grew up with. Man, I was starting to think that after 2 lackluster ones in a row, that they were starting to lose some steam. But that clearly wasn't the case, at least not yet, because they put out 2 excellent ones back to back. This one's great for the simple fact of the matter, this one contains some of the best timed and most painful looking slapstick violence of Tom and Jerry's repertoire. So many great little moments, like when Tom accidentally hits himself with a sledgehammer, he takes the time to set it down before collapsing. And if you can get that one single element done right, then everything else will fall right into place. Also, I guess Tom went to the same school of running away from things that Noomi Rapace and Charlize Theron went to. Saturday Evening Puss. Here's a case of a cartoon that's primarily known for one particular moment or aspect of it, and in 2 completely separate ways. So, I haven't had much of a chance to actually talk about Mammy Two Shoes so far, so I guess here's as good a time as any. So yes, a lot of these early cartoons had Tom's owner, possibly? Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. Be a black woman, or more specifically, a caricature of a black woman. Now, all things considered, for the time period, Mammy Two Shoes was not that bad. Yes, she's a typical Mammy stereotype, but A, we never see her face, so there's no blackface, and B, she's actually portrayed by a black voice actress, in this case, Lillian Randolph. So it's not a white actor just doing a black voice, which automatically makes Mammy Two Shoes more progressive than Cleveland Brown. I guess some people also said it was offensive because she was a maid, but honestly, the cartoons are kind of inconsistent as to what exactly her relationship with Tom is. Is she the live-in maid to a white, unseen family that has to deal the most with Tom? Or does she actually own the house they're in and Tom is actually her cat? I don't know. For me, bottom line, I've never quite understood the immense backlash this character got. Certainly not enough to want to erase her. Speaking of which, all this to say this cartoon in particular is infamous for a re-edited and reanimated version that was released in 1966, where Mammy Two Shoes was replaced by a white teenage girl who, instead of going to her bridge club, went out dancing with her boyfriend. Boy, talk about whitewashing and black erasure. Now, the re-edited version is the inferior cut, simply for the fact that you can tell while watching it that there's something off about it, even if you're unfamiliar with the controversy. But it's also the fact of the matter that the ending of this cartoon is by far the funniest part, and this edit significantly butchers it. But anyway, I think that's more than enough backstory. How's the actual cartoon? As I hinted at before, this is a case of a cartoon that I think would be kind of just seen as a regular, ordinary Tom and Jerry cartoon if it wasn't for the ending. I mean, the music is mostly good, and there's some solid slapstick and facial reactions, but nothing that I would say is highly elevated. That is, until Jerry actually calls Mammy Two Shoes to let her know what's going on, which I just realized means that Jerry was actually speaking to her with words on the phone, which I don't know what to do with that information, and she realizes that there's a party at her house. This is when you realize that this was the reason this cartoon was made, solely so they could bring this one moment to life. There are other better videos that can break this moment down, but there really is just so much brilliant comedy jam-packed in under 30 seconds. The timing, the visual gags, the expressions, the absolute rage you can feel in Mammy Two Shoes' voice. Everything about it is sheer and utter perfection. This is probably the absolute best Mammy enacts punishment on Tom reaction out of her yet, and it's worth watching just for that moment alone. And of course the ending punchline is a funny note to go out on. A bit obvious perhaps, but it's done quite well regardless. Why play Leapfrog? Basically more of the same economics lessons from the previous John Sutherland cartoons, but this time with more of an emphasis on specialization, and how raw materials in the product itself don't necessarily equate to the product's actual worth. I guess if you needed this as a tool for classrooms, it's perfectly fine, but once again, the economics lesson takes precedence over the gags, which means there's not much reason to watch it on its own. Although this one-way ticket joke is a nice little macabre moment. Texas Tom. Hanna-Barbera give Tom and Jerry another shot of energy by putting them in a situation they haven't been in before, in this case on a Texas ranch. Yeah, the typical formula being so established by this point means there aren't many surprises, but thankfully the payoffs of the jokes are usually funny enough that it doesn't matter all that much. Take for example the branding joke. It may be an obvious direction for them to take, but Tom's reaction makes the moment work. Jerry and the Lion. Jerry, buddy, how much food do you actually need? Like, this goes far beyond survival. Anyway, this is another likable Tom and Jerry outing without doing anything particularly exceptional. The lion does have a likable personality, but we also don't see anywhere near enough of him expressing said personality, instead becoming more of a silent force of nature. But I do kind of like this bit where Tom thinks that he shot Jerry and actually tries to help him, something that, of course, Jerry takes advantage of. And then there's this classic moment of Tom getting his smug mug slapped off his face by the lion. Little moments like these do go a long way in helping keep this formula fresh and entertaining. It also helps that the slapstick continues to impress. Ventriloquist Cat. This is more or less a sequel to Counterfeit Cat, with the same cat and dog duo fighting, and this one's quite the improvement. The comedy's a lot funnier and tighter, even if it kind of abandons its core concept by the halfway point, and it feels like the segues could have been smoothed out a little bit. But what's on the screen is funny and features that typical Tex Avery shenanigans, which is all that really matters. The Cuckoo Clock. The opening bit is a surprisingly gloomy, atmospheric piece of animation, and with narration that feels very reminiscent of the works of Edgar Allan Poe, in particular The Telltale Heart. But then by the 2-minute mark, the cartoon kind of reverts into pretty much exactly what you'd expect for a Tex Avery chase cartoon. I kind of wish the cartoon had gone all out with the Poe parody it had initially set up, because it kind of feels like a joke without much of a punchline. But again, when what's on the screen is getting laughs, I can only complain so much. Safety Second. Nibbles wants to celebrate the birth of the United States of America as dangerous and freedom-loving as possible, but Wet Blanket Jerry has to remind him, like an 80s PSA, that fireworks and firecrackers are dangerous. That's not very patriotic of you, Jerry.
He may be a communist.
Anyway, this is a nice twist on the formula by having Jerry also be the brunt of some of the slapstick courtesy of Nibbles, and some of these reactions are quite funny. And of course, once Tom enters the picture, we get that slapstick that we all know and love. Plus, we get the always classic Jerry socks Tom in the eye gag, which is always a plus, even if we've seen it done before. Albert in Blunderland. Out of the Cold War propaganda cartoons of the group, this is probably the best, if for no other reason than it actually tells a story to get its point across, rather than simply having a narrator explain basic economic principles. Plus, this cartoon does have some respect for the audience's intelligence by using visuals and sardonicism to make its points, rather than explaining absolutely everything. And there are some unique visuals that make this stand out above the crowd. I still would have preferred some funnier gags, but for what it is, it's fine. Also, I do have to admire the irony of this cartoon mocking state-produced propaganda films that communist states make, while being itself a propaganda film. Tom and Jerry in the Hollywood Bowl. Not too dissimilar to the Cat Concerto, and no doubt this was made to try to capture some of that one's success. And while not quite as great as that masterpiece, it's hard to argue that this doesn't contain some of that one's strengths. The elegance, the scope, portraying Tom and Jerry's fight as more of a tango of violence, and utilizing the setting to its advantage. So yes, it may technically be a lesser version of the Cat Concerto, but a lesser version of the Cat Concerto still makes for a great, highly enjoyable experience. Garden Gopher. The more time has gone on, I feel like Tex Avery has slowed down a little bit in terms of his energy, with timing that's a lot closer to a typical Friz Freleng cartoon rather than old school Avery. And this is probably one of the best examples of that I can think of. There's nothing really wrong with this, it's a good cartoon, but with the exception of this eggplant joke, everything just feels like Avery going through the motions. The Framed Cat. A lot of this is kind of stuff we've seen before. Jerry trying to get Tom in trouble, Spike threatening to beat up Tom if he does X, Y, and Z, and even most of the slapstick gags are kind of just repeats of things we've seen before. Like, for example, this jackass bit was done in Solid Serenade, only it's not done quite as well here. The most memorable part is the magnet gag, where Spike is trying desperately to keep his bone away from Tom's tail. Why are you looking at me like that? And even the final gag of Jerry being pulled along into the chase by the magnet kind of feels like the start of a punchline, but without really a sense of finality or comeuppance to it. So the ending feels rather bare. It's still got a few amusing moments, but the timing of everything is just a little bit off compared to what we're used to. The Chump Champ. Another one of those fun, villain tries to get the upper hand on Droopy, who manages to defeat them with just the tiniest flicker of energy cartoons. There's not that much uniqueness in terms of the gags, but it moves at such a quick, fast pace that it ultimately doesn't really matter. It's just fun, which is all it needs to be. Cue Ball Cat. First bowling, then golf, then tennis. Now Tom and Jerry get their hands dirty with the godless, sinful sport of pool. This is actually such an inspired idea that I can't believe it took them a decade to come up with it. Lots of clever moments in here, like Tom toying with Jerry by lighting the pool ball rack on fire, to the brilliant gag of Jerry making Tom pull himself through the pool table by his tail, to the moment of Tom swallowing all the pool balls in rapid succession. This is just filled with one great moment after another. Anyway, what I'm getting from all of this is that when Tom and Jerry take part in a sports cartoon, great things happen. Also, I can't be the only one that thinks that this cartoon was the inspiration for the Schoolhouse Rock song Naughty Number 9, right? The Peachy Cobbler. This one takes quite a bit from a previous Warner Brothers cartoon, Hollywood for Shoestrings, a cartoon that had been made 4 years prior by that point, and to a lesser extent Busy Bakers, which had been released 10 years prior, to the point that plot beats and even entire gags are lifted from them wholesale. The only major difference is Tex Avery puts a lot of energy into it like you would expect, and the elves all talk like the chipmunks for some reason. For what it is, it's fine, but I just kind of have to scratch my head as to why this idea was so good in the first place, that Tex Avery more or less had to remake a cartoon that he himself didn't even make. Casanova Cat. You know, you have got to give MGM some credit. Even when every other cartoon animation studio had decided that blackface gags were no longer in vogue, only they had the gumption to stick with their guns and keep the tradition alive. Anyway, even trying to take that aside, this one really doesn't have a ton to offer. A lot of this is stuff we've seen before. Tom offering Jerry as a gift to a female cat. Butch and Tom fighting over Toodles galore. Tom and Butch both trying to get at Jerry. Even the ending punchline of the girl cat that Tom is trying to woo choosing Jerry over him. None of this is new at all. Aside from the angle of Tom being a gold digger trying to get at the girl cat's fortune. But that honestly doesn't add anything. I would put this in the strictly watchable camp, but given how this is one that you have to go out of your way to try to find in order to watch it, I wouldn't say it's worth the extra energy unless you're a completionist. Fresh Laid Plans. Another pro-capitalist Cold War propaganda cartoon. And again, much like Albert in Blenderland, instead of going just straightforward proselytizing, it goes the allegorical route, with a story that takes place on a farm. In fact, I have to wonder just how inspired the creators of this cartoon were by George Orwell's Animal Farm. Now, some of this imagery is a little bit too on the nose, like how the crow changes his truck from free market to black market, but this cartoon does do a decent job at illustrating the concept of unintended consequences of price fixing. Okay, not perfectly and done simplistically, but done in a way that will stick with the audience more instead of if they were simply lectured on it. Cock-a-doodle Dog. As I said before, trying to maintain a high energy, high joke per minute ratio can be a big challenge, even for a very talented creator. After a while, the gags kind of start becoming predictable, especially if you're relying on the same old subverting the audience techniques. And normally I would complain about the fact that the rooster is crowing all day long when you would think that a rooster would only crow at sunrise, but I remember when my next door neighbor had a pet rooster, and brother, would that thing crow at any hour it felt like. But as typical cartoon chase antics go, it's fine, absolutely watchable and good for a few chuckles, but nothing that's really gonna stick. Jerry and the Goldfish. There are traces of Kitty foiled in here, with the setup of Jerry and another small pet both fighting against Tom, but this time it's a goldfish instead of a canary. Again, I can't give it points for originality, but it gets the slapstick down pretty well, like Tom's teeth being lifted up like a window shade, or Tom turning into a dachshund for a second. And I do have to admire the extreme lengths that Jerry will go through to try to save his friend. This one is just a good balance of sweet and heartwarming with the cruel and vindictive. Daredevil Droopy. Bearing some superficial similarities to the yet-to-be-released Big Top Bunny, this is more or less Droopy and Spike doing the same shtick they did in the Chump Champ. Lots of gags thrown in here, and it just goes, and doesn't stop for the entire 6-minute runtime. A lot of them are standard and pretty much what you'd expect, but there are a few that really stand out, although some of the repeating does knock it down a little. Jerry's Cousin. Another classic Tom and Jerry cartoon. It has such a good setup with the character of Cousin Muscles, who is such an entertaining and memorable character that I am shocked that he never made another appearance after this, who just wails the ever-loving crap out of Tom. Every joke is funny, the timing is impeccable, the reaction's gold, and I do appreciate how they don't do the tired Tom thinks that Jerry is Muscles bit until the very end. And I also love how Tom's idea of picking on Jerry this time is that he's literally just throwing firecrackers into Jerry's hole for literally no reason. That is just so pointlessly sadistic, even by Tom's standards. And it makes what happens to him throughout the cartoon all the more satisfying. There honestly isn't really much else to say about it. It's just a compact treat that does a typical Tom and Jerry formula about as well as you can expect. Droopy's Good Deed. More typical Spike and Droopy shenanigans. It kind of suffers from the same problem of Daredevil Droopy in that there's a lot of repeating of old gags without really having a unique twist on it. I kind of feel like the more effort you have to put into making Droopy look effortless, the less funny he tends to be. He tends to be funnier when he's a godlike force of nature, paired with somebody with high-octane energy. Otherwise, there's not much to differentiate him from any other karmic trickster cartoon character. but that doesn't mean this thing is totally devoid of funny moments. It's still plenty good fun, and the execution of the gags is good enough that it's worth at least a watch. Sleepy Time Tom. Wait a second. Aren't cats nocturnal by nature? 0 out of 10, the plot makes no sense, everything is ruined. Okay, in all seriousness, this one's got some similarities to cartoons like Part-Time Pal and Mouse Cleaning, but with the formula tweaked just enough so that it stands apart from the crowd. Gotta love in this one how Jerry's strategy to get rid of Tom this time around is to kill him with kindness. Not one of the absolute funniest cartoons out there, but it's got some cute gags and takes as much advantage of the concept as you would expect. Overall, a good'un. I just, these clips sure are making me sleepy. I wonder if the audience would mind if I could just take a break, just for a few. The waffles are in the fireplace, don't shoot! Oh, sorry, I think I dozed off for just a second. Did I miss anything?
All the rainforests are being chopped down, nobody votes anymore, and the internet's too dang slow.
You could have just said no. Symphony in Slang. Tex Avery dares ask the question, what would happen if jive talk and similes and figures of speech were used to tell a story as literally as humanly possible? This is a plot that is tailor-made for his style of humor, and it is throwing so many gags at us a minute. This is one of those cartoons that doesn't really have peaks and valleys, it just goes the whole runtime. This is also the most different looking out of all the MGM cartoons so far, with a very flat UPA style. I'm not entirely sure what the reason was for the sudden shift, but for this cartoon, it matches the tone for the style of humor. Plus, I think it kinda makes sense that for a cartoon that's playfully skewering modern slang, that it would use a modernistic animation style to do it. This is easily one of Tex Avery's more underrated efforts, and deserves more attention and recognition. Nothing could possibly ruin my good mood. His Mouse Friday. I have got to stop tempting fate like that. Ah yes, the old cartoon characters visiting darkest Africa and stumbling across some native cannibals plot. This would fit right at home with the cartoons of this era if this had been released a decade or two ago? So yeah, by the 50s, these kinds of cartoons were becoming less and less acceptable than they were, to the point that I'm surprised that this even got made. But then again, Warner Brothers had released Which is Which just 2 years prior, so they're not exactly innocent here either. Honestly, even trying to put the subject matter aside, there really is not much here. Most of the cartoon is just Jerry pretending to be a cannibal and tricking Tom into making himself into cat stew. It's not really that funny or inventive, and I'm struggling to even understand why Hanna-Barbera thought this premise was worth bringing to the big screen. Slicked Up Pup. This one basically merges the two great cartoons Mouse Cleaning with Love That Pup, a winning combination that produces some solid laughs. One of my favorite bits has to be the moment where Tom desperately tries to convince Spike that a tar and feather tyke is actually a rooster. I will say, I would have preferred the ending to be a little bit punchier, but aside from that, I don't really have any complaints. Car of Tomorrow. Let's see, car puns, women's drivers jokes, car puns, a GTA prediction, and more car puns. As you would expect, some of the gags work, some of them don't. One of them goes on way too long for too weak a payoff, but overall another solid entry in Tex Avery's Tomorrow series. Knit Witty Kitty. Give this one credit, it does not dawdle with pointless exposition and setup. It gives you the hook from the get-go. This one seems a bit more deranged than your typical Tom and Jerry cartoon, with some facial expressions and pacing that feels a little bit more like a Bob Clampett light style cartoon than you would expect at this point in time. The premise is one that I'm not crazy about. I don't think it necessarily opens itself up to that many possibilities for jokes that we haven't already seen before, but I also can't pretend that this doesn't produce a few funny or amusing moments. Just not quite as much as I would have preferred. Inside Cackle Corners. Here it is, the last of the Cold War era cartoons made by John Sutherland Productions and distributed by MGM. This entire cartoon is basically highlighting the importance of development and research within capitalism in order to keep up with the competition in an ever-evolving market, which kind of feels like should be a lesson that really only businessmen and entrepreneurs would need to know. I'm not really sure I get the point in producing a whole cartoon explaining that concept to something that, by and large, would not affect the layman. As a historical artifact, there's definitely some intrigue to be found within, but it's not really exploring anything that any other cartoon didn't already explore, and it's not funny or creative enough to compensate for it. Drewby's Double Trouble. A perfectly fine concept of mistaken identity that works just well for a cartoon that is taken advantage of. Lots of high-energy bouts of violence, even if it starts to get a little bit repetitive by the end. And there was also this slight feeling that by this point, Tex Avery is starting to get a little burnt out from making cartoons non-stop for over a decade and a half. Some of the gags and reactions don't really feel like his heart is fully in this. Not enough that it's distracting, but enough that if you were aware that he would be taking a year-long sabbatical not too long after this, that you can sense it. Catnapping. Jerry can sleep while falling through the air, but wakes up when some ants are just carrying him away. Sure. Anyway, this one's a funny little battle between them that escalates and escalates the longer it goes on, while featuring some slapstick gags that I haven't seen before in their cartoons. And I love how by the end, Jerry doesn't even care if he gets the hammock or not. He just wants to make sure that Tom doesn't get it, which is another added level of pettiness that I can get behind. Some great reactions near the end and the slapstick timing help overcome its rather slow beginning. The Flying Cat. This is basically a sequel to Kitty Foiled, up to including the same canary from that cartoon. There's not really a sense of forward momentum for these series of gags, and it introduces the idea of Tom teaching himself how to fly just a little bit too late in the cartoon for my liking, which wouldn't be too big of an issue if the timing on the slapstick gags was up to snuff, but for whatever reason, most of it isn't quite as hard-hitting as it feels like it should be, with the exception of this monster of a crotch shot. That was a great moment. A lot of the laughs come primarily from the facial reactions, like this canary's reaction to seeing Tom fly for the first time. It may be a little bit jumbled and discordant, but the strong moments do shine through in the end. Magical Maestro. The only Tex Avery cartoon to date to be selected for the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress. And while there are better shorts he made out there, I think it's very easy to see why this one was selected. This is one where the plot matches Tex Avery's sensibilities. A character that's a magician that has the ability to do whatever he wants and injects as much chaos into his show that tickles his fancy. So in some ways, you could make an argument that this is a subtle meta-commentary about how Tex Avery saw himself as a creator, with him as a magician torturing his characters. And to drive that point home, he includes just about every kind of gag he can think of in such a short runtime. Probably the most famous gag within is the hair gag, wherein a piece of hair gets caught in the film strip and was flying over the scene before Butch has had enough and plucks it out. Yet another instance of showing Tex Avery's love of breaking the fourth wall. As I previously mentioned, Tex Avery was just about creatively exhausted by this point, but it really does seem like he tried to squeeze out one final breath of creativity before he reached that breaking point. The Duck Doctor. Here we've got yet another Jerry protects a small young bird from Tom's Raft cartoon. This time a duck that sounds like Little Quacker and yet has a different color scheme but is clearly supposed to be the same character. I think it spends just a little bit too much time on the setup. I did want the first half in particular to kind of get sped up a little, but it does have its moments. In particular, this one puts an emphasis on Tom's savagery, which does make the slapstick comeuppance that does come his way feel all the more satisfying. But this cartoon simply cannot escape the feeling of been there, done that. The most original moment is this bit where Tom realizes that it doesn't matter where he stands because he's going to get hit by the anvil regardless and just accepts his fate. That's a nice little bit of subtle medium awareness. The Two Mouseketeers. Ah yes, this one. The Tom and Jerry cartoon with the most famous, or rather infamous, ending. But since that only takes up a small part of this cartoon, we're going to save that for the end. And honestly, even without the ending, this would still be a well-remembered cartoon, primarily because of the setting. Because it's set in pre-revolutionary France, the fight between Jerry and Nibbles and Tom takes on a class warfare commentary, with Tom representing the aristocracy and Jerry and Nibbles representing the commoners. And of course, they take aim against the French, which is thankfully just about the only nationality you can still make fun of today without having to worry about an internet hate mob. And this is some really fine slapstick, wherein the stabs, the facial expressions, the screams, they're all working together in perfect unison. On top of that, this one is a feast for the eyes. Not just with the food porn. Not that kinda. Anyway, the food on screen is just a delight to look at. And the backgrounds and elegance and the excellent costume design, to even just the random details of having Nibbles speaking only in French, really makes this one stand out in the Tom and Jerry catalog. But then, of course, there is the ending. Okay, so for those of you that don't know, this cartoon ends with Tom getting beheaded for failing to do his job of not properly guarding the food. And there are other Tom and Jerry cartoons where he's died before, but there are several things that separate this from those other moments. The most obvious is that it's surprisingly kinda horrific. I mean, getting decapitated, even if it happens off screen, is not a pretty way to go. Secondly, the moment is treated with a somberness that kinda draws attention to it. It's not really played for laughs, so that kinda makes the moment more real than the creators probably intended. And third, this wasn't really a case of Tom getting overconfident in getting his just desserts. He was a guard that was supposed to be doing his job of protecting the king's food. And when he failed at the task, he was met with the sharp end of a guillotine for his troubles. So a lot of people think that the ending to this one is just too mean and cruel. And that's an argument I can understand. But Tom and Jerry is kinda supposed to be a little mean and cruel. It didn't really bother me, primarily because the execution itself is a prelude to a joke about Nibbles saying, "C'est la guerre," or "that's war." Plus, you could also make the argument that, going off on that class warfare commentary idea, it's making the argument that those whose job it was to protect the aristocracy were actually on the lowest of the social totem pole, because they did not have the respect of either the aristocracy or the lower class. Probably another one of those overthinking things again, but that's why I get paid the big bucks, to overthink. Anyway, regardless what you think about the ending, I don't think that diminishes this one's status. It's fun, flows beautifully, and everything is in tandem. It's a well-remembered classic for a reason. Smitten Kitten. Well, it's that time again.
To change our underwear?
Why would you... Okay, no. It's clip show time. I guess we've reached the point where either to save money or to fill a slot in the schedule, MGM decided... Wait a second. Didn't I just open up a review with this exact same opening line and joke? And in fact, didn't I steal this exact same joke from my Looney Tunes Part 10 video? Well, I decided, if they can recycle their old material, I don't see why I can't either. Anyway, the only way to really judge these kind of cartoons is to look at how good the framing device is and the quality of the clips that they're using. The framing device is not really that great. It's basically just a rehash of Springtime for Thomas, and it doesn't really do a good job giving the clips any added context to make them funnier. And the clips themselves aren't the best that they could have emphasized. They're not bad by any stretch because they're all from great cartoons, but with the exception of the one from The Mouse Comes to Dinner, I'm not entirely sure why these clips were selected out of all the ones that they could have picked from. Anyway, as with most clip shows, it's still perfectly watchable, although because we can watch the originals whenever we want, this doesn't feel particularly needed. Triplet Trouble. 3 little kittens take full advantage of their cutesy cuteness in order to be nasty little turds. And I love the speed and energy in which we find out very quickly what they're all about and what their dynamic is gonna be. I also love how Jerry is laughing at how they're treating Tom until he realizes that they're not gonna play favorites and torture him for some time as well. And of course, we get the inevitable bit of Tom and Jerry both realizing that these 3 must be stopped, and thus have to work together to defeat a common enemy. All in all, this is just a fun, delightfully mean outing. One Cab's Family. Existing in a world where humans and anthropomorphic cars coexist, which is Certainly an interesting choice. This one's Tex Avery's attempt at trying to be cutesier than his typical wild shenanigans, while also telling a tale as old as time. The story of the young rebellious kid who has dreams and aspirations that don't line up with what the parents want. But I think by having the story acted out by a family of cars, there's a certain parodic element to it. And Tex Avery manages to sneak in some surreal imagery, like the papa car opening up his son's trunk to spank him. This isn't anything great, but it's a neat little treat. Fun, enjoyable, and surreal without reinventing the wheel. You see what I did there? Wheel, because they're cars, and cars have wheels? I don't know how I do it sometimes. Little Runaway. Yet another entry in the Animal Asked Jerry for Help cartoon. This time with a seal escaping from the circus, presumably as a response to the cartoon Mickey and the Seal. Nothing about this one is particularly new, as you would expect by this point, although it does have its great moments, like the bit of Jerry pretending that Tom's fish is alive and dancing, and the visual gag of having the seal transform into a literal pile of money. The ending gag is a little bit predictable. I kinda would have preferred it if there was an added gag on top of it, but still, this manages to be an enjoyable, if not terribly protruded outing. Rockabye Bear, Tex Avery's final cartoon before his sabbatical, and it looks like he was able to squeeze out one last bout of creative energy through his burnout. This one really ups the sadism by not only having a character inflict incredible amounts of pain upon another character, but to also be put in a situation where he's not allowed to make any noise in spite of said pain. This shares a lot of similarities to the likes of Dumb Hounded and Northwest Hounded Police, wherein it's more or less the same basic gag being repeated over and over again, and Tex Avery still manages to keep it fresh and exciting throughout it all. And it's so nice to see that even by this point, Avery still hasn't lost his magic touch. Fit to be Tied. Tom and Jerry cartoons have repeated plots before, but never quite so blatantly as this. This is basically a retelling of The Bodyguard, only this time its comparison to The Lion and the Mouse is much more direct. One aspect that I really appreciated about this one in comparison to The Bodyguard was that it actually includes a new element that wasn't originally present. Namely, that Jerry actually does take full advantage of the situation to make Tom his servant. And then there's the added storyline of the new leash law preventing Spike from coming to his rescue. And this cartoon takes full advantage of it, including paying homage to Foghorn Leghorn. Anyway, a great update, lots of fantastic slapstick, and because it tells the repeated story slightly differently than in the original, it justifies its own existence. Push Button Kitty. Tom has his job of catching mice be supplanted by technology, and Jerry finds that he prefers to have Tom around as the cat of the house because Tom was so bad at his job. But then Mammy Two Shoes learns the hard way that she'd rather have a lazy, good-for-nothing old-fashioned cat around the house than a destructive newfangled machine that does its job a little too well. Interestingly, Tom doesn't even factor much into this, only appearing at the beginning and at the end. Most of the cartoon is made up of Jerry trying to get past the robot cat, which honestly doesn't really do that much to twist the formula. The antics are amusing, but not the funniest that I've seen. There's not really that many moments that I would consider stand out. Really, the only noteworthy thing about this is that this was the final appearance of Mammy Two Shoes, and the last MGM cartoon where Lillian Randolph provided her voice. And like I said, even though Mammy Two Shoes was a caricature, I'm still gonna miss hearing that voice scream out Tom's name in pure, unadulterated rage. Thank you for the laughs, Lillian Randolph, and you certainly deserved better, but you left behind a legacy worth remembering regardless. Caballero Droopy. So now we've made it to the Dick Lundy directed cartoons, the man who took over for Tex Avery following his sabbatical. And this is not a bad attempt at trying to emulate Avery's style. It does certainly have that madcap feel to it like you would expect, but that's also kind of the big issue here. It does pale in comparison to Avery's work. It feels more like it's trying to capture someone else's vision rather than a creator trying to find his own voice. And some of the gags are too telegraphed, like this bit of the weight flying into the air before landing on the wolf. The premise for the joke is fine, but the timing isn't quite right. A lot of this cartoon has that kind of feel to it that permeates it. Now, it's not completely devoid of charm, like this bit of Droopy pretending that he's a bull, but this is not some of MGM's finest work. Cruise Cat. Tom and Jerry on a cruise ship, and seemingly made as MGM's response to Tweety's SOS from the previous year. Anyway, this is the typical Tom and Jerry shenanigans, but it just so happens to take place on a ship. That's really about the only hook it needs. It's entertaining and delivers on the slapstick. The strangest thing about it is the bit where Tom and Jerry run into a theater and just watch one of their old cartoons, specifically Texas Tom, for a little bit. There's no explanation for this. It's literally like this cartoon just takes a break just to show a minute of one of their old cartoons. Normally, I'd complain about blatant recycling of old clips to pad the runtime, but the way it's handled is just so surreal and bizarre that I have to admire it. The Little Wise Quacker. So I guess after deciding that putting Dick Lundy in charge of Droopy cartoons wasn't going to cut it, MGM decided that the best course of action was to resurrect a previously hibernated Barney Bear, bring him back, and make some cartoons with him. That I don't have an issue with, since I think there was always a way they could have made Barney Bear work, and giving a newcomer a chance to remold it into something viable was not a bad idea. I think the more pressing issue here is that this is a blatant ripoff of Lucky Ducky, only not as funny. Now, I do appreciate this is not merely trying to copy Tex Avery's style of humor, it is trying to find its own identity. I can't really say there's much in here that's really funny, but it is amusing enough. And if nothing else, it's interesting to see how a director tackles the same plot as a different director, even if the end result is obviously inferior. The Doghouse. Another entry in the Spike threatens to beat up Tom within an inch of his life if he gets in his way cartoon. And you know what I always say, if a formula ain't broke, there ain't no reason to fix it. Maybe I could nitpick that Spike doesn't beat up Tom after the first time his house is destroyed rather than, like, the 7th time. But honestly, when the slapstick is this well executed, a detail like that can be overlooked. Busybody Bear. There are a few fundamental problems with this one. Probably the most damaging is that the animation is simply too rubbery. The slapstick is not hard-hitting at all. And the second is that this premise simply doesn't fit Barney Bear's character at all. Barney Bear tended to work better as a grumpy curmudgeon, not a blissfully unaware, if self-meaning imbecile. Maybe this was an experiment to see if Barney's character could be drastically reworked into something completely different. And if that was the case, then hopefully they learned not to do it again. The Missing Mouse. Here's a great thinking outside the box Tom and Jerry premise. Tom believes Jerry to be a mouse that, if any violence is inflicted upon it, will cause the mouse to explode. So basically, it's the climax to Mouse Mazurka, only the premise is stretched to an entire cartoon. And this cartoon takes full advantage of this setup. I personally love the bit where after Jerry's secret has been exposed, he hits himself while trying to scare Tom, only to hit himself just a little bit too hard. And once again, it's a bit predictable where the cartoon is headed, but as always, the build-up and execution of the joke that you know is coming is what makes the payoff so funny. Barney's Hungry Cousin. So this is where Hanna-Barbera got the idea for Yogi Bear. I mean, it even takes place at Jellystone National Park, for crying out loud. Anyway, this is a better attempt at doing a Barney Bear cartoon than Dick Lundy's 2 previous outings. There is this sense in which Lundy and the animators are more on the same wavelength. This one has toppers to give the gags a bit more punch. Like how in this bit where the Hungry Bear not only steals Barney's sandwich here, but uses Barney's hand as a seat just to add insult to injury. It's little details like that that do help this cartoon. Although I'm not entirely sure why it's called Barney's Hungry Cousin, when there is absolutely no indication that Barney even knows who this bear is, let alone that they're cousins. Jerry and Jumbo. So not only is this one pretty much a blatant recycling of Jerry and the Lion, but the second half is pretty much a hippity-hopper ripoff. But both of these things are forgivable for the simple fact of the matter that this is just funny. After a kind of slow start, this cartoon really picks up with some great bits of slapstick. Most famously, the bit where Tom tries to set a giant mouse trap, only to be pulled into it by the baby elephant. Also, I do have to mention just how quickly Jerry accepted that there was just an elephant in the living room. I guess Jerry's seen it all by this point, so nothing surprises him anymore. Cobbs and Robbers. This continues the trend of Dick Lundy actually finding his footing with these Barney Bear cartoons. I said before that he was trying too hard to copy Tex Avery, but here it feels like more he was inspired by Tex Avery's style. He's not hiding where he's getting his influence from, but it feels like he's putting his own unique spin into it. He's not trying to trick you into thinking that you're actually watching a Tex Avery cartoon. Plus, the timing is a lot better, the plot doesn't feel derivative of something else, and there are some good reactions here. I would have preferred if this was a little longer and if there was more to it, but generally this is a solid cartoon. Johann Mouse. There is definitely this sense that this one is trying to ride on the coattails of the Cat Concerto, with the piano motif and the idea of Tom and Jerry's fight being more of a waltz of violence, albeit this one is a bit more plot-focused than the Cat Concerto, which was a lot more slapstick and atmosphere-driven. This one isn't anywhere near as elegant as it thinks it is, and also it takes way too long to introduce the setup. There's certainly nothing really wrong with it per se, it's perfectly serviceable for what it is, but with just how much weight this one is giving itself, I think it should be a lot better than simply serviceable. Little Johnny Jet. Well, now Tex Avery has returned from resting his brain, and his response was to do something of a remake of One Cab's Family, except with planes. Except this time there's some added commentary about soldiers that returned home from the war, but found themselves unable to find good work due to high demand and low supply, as well as tinges of a Little Engine That Could or John Henry type of story for good measure. And it is pretty interesting that for the first 5 minutes, this is very un-Tex Avery-like in terms of the style of humor, with much slower and drier social commentary taking center stage. But then he completely lets himself go in the last 2 minutes, with gag after gag after gag, one right after the other, topped off by a pretty suggestive ending punchline. I can't say that all these pieces really fit together, and it's a little bit busy in trying to make all these pieces fit together, but it's an admirable and adept attempt nonetheless. That's My Pup. This is probably the most un-Tom and Jerry cartoon to date, and I don't necessarily mean that as a compliment. Most of this cartoon is just Tom being bullied by Spike into pretending that he's scared of Tyke. Honestly, Jerry doesn't affect the plot at all, to the point that he may as well not even be here. And would it really have killed them to make Tom do something a little bit more antagonistic towards Spike and Tyke, closer to the beginning, so that it feels like the torment is a little bit more warranted? Because otherwise, it really paints Spike in a pretty bad light, all things considered. And if you're going to be cruel like this, you had better be funny. And I don't think this is quite as funny as it thinks it is. An occasional funny reaction does help here, but this one is pretty subpar for Tom and Jerry. Air Bear. This is a perfectly fine, completely unremarkable chase-type cartoon. There are plenty of much better and funnier character chases after a gopher cartoons out there. But if, for some reason, that's just a cartoon plot that you really just cannot get enough of, I mean, it gives what it advertises, but it doesn't really aspire for much beyond that. TV of Tomorrow. This is the Tex Avery that I know and love. Jokes thrown at you a million miles a minute, and of course a skewering of a piece of contemporary suburban life that, honestly, has only gotten even better with age. From how people are so obsessed with having a screen in their own home that they can't take their eyes off the screen, to even how television has ruined many different sleep schedules. It is just so fascinating to watch a theatrical cartoon satirizing the very thing that would wind up supplanting it. But far from being just a time capsule of a bygone era, most especially with its commentary about how pervasive the Western genre was during this period of time, but this is just a funny cartoon irrespective of that. I mean, okay, this isn't the sharpest writing in the world, but it is a very enjoyable and energetic fun time. All the intriguing zeitgeist elements are simply an added bonus on top. Wee Willie Wildcat. I've never understood the temptation to try to make Barney Bear into a more talkative character. He was generally at his best whenever he was a mostly silent protagonist. Anyway, the premise of this one is that Barney decides that his neighbor is being too nasty by spanking his child, and so Barney's solution is to basically kidnap him and try to raise him using child psychology, only to subsequently realize that the child really is a nasty little snot who just can't be reasoned with. So is this supposed to be a pro-corporal punishment cartoon? Honestly, probably not. I think Dick Lundy was just using this setup as an excuse to cram in as many slapstick bits as humanly possible. Most of them are just fine, but to me, the real standout moment is the rock in the football bit. The way we get to see Barney's entire skeletal structure get crushed to dust was just such a creative visual for a slapstick bit. That one moment alone knocked it up a rating for me. Just Ducky. This is basically the same cartoon as Little Quacker if they had added a plot about Little Quacker being unable to swim, which is bizarre to say the very least, and something that takes up way too much screen time in setting it up. This is another example of a cartoon that takes way too long to bring Tom into the fold, but again, once he does enter the picture, the slapstick does work and works really well. The ending is definitely unique for a Tom and Jerry cartoon, wherein Little Quacker and Jerry actually save Tom from drowning, and they end up friends as a result. Now, I'm not against having these softer endings in general, but I'm not sure what came before it that really justified this ending. It kinda comes out of nowhere. Still, those are comparatively minor complaints when its highs are pretty high. Half Pint Palomino. This is another one of those trying too hard to be cutesy cartoons. There is absolutely nothing here that hasn't been done in any other cartoon before it, and not really done in an interesting or unique way. The plot is standard, the slapstick gags are standard, and the timing isn't anything to write home about either. This is one that was destined to be forgotten simply because there is nothing about it that stands out. Two Little Indians. I guess MGM decided that if they couldn't make fun of black stereotypes anymore, they decided to go with the next best thing, Native American stereotypes. Although helping this one's case is that these are characters acting out the stereotypes rather than the Indians themselves being stereotypical, which makes sense given the time period and within the context of the story. And there are several great moments here, like one of the orphans trying to shoot at Spike's uvula with an arrow, and Jerry having to try to play it off by pretending the bow and arrow is a violin, to even something as simple as one of the orphans cutting off Tom's tail, which just goes to show that even the simplest bit of slapstick can still be funny if you know how to properly implement it. Life with Tom. Oh look, another Tom and Jerry clip show. This time they're ripping off a previous one with Jerry's diary. Do I really need to spend a ton of time explaining why clip shows don't work again?
Not really.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Moving on. The Three Little Pups. Once again, Tex Avery takes aim at the Three Little Pigs story. And this time, Avery has dry, deadpan characters fighting against other dry, deadpan characters, while the slapstick itself continues to be wild and chaotic. The underreactions in a strange way make the anarchy seem just a little bit weirder than it otherwise would have. I couldn't really say I'm the biggest fan of the animation style for this one. I don't think the UPA style really makes Avery's slapstick pop like it should, but that doesn't diminish too much what's an otherwise fun outing. Puppy Tail. Once again, we've been hit with yet another cute animal crosses Jerry's doorstep and he takes on a paternalistic role of caring for them cartoon. Apparently, for some reason, this was Hanna-Barbera's go-to plot when they couldn't think of anything else. I mean, it's cute enough for what it is, but this one is seriously lacking in the slapstick department. It's primarily just Tom getting annoyed that a puppy is invading his personal space, and then feeling guilty about locking Jerry and the pupper out into a thunderstorm. I guess you could make the argument that this is trying to be more story-based, but why? Especially when the story it's telling isn't particularly unique. In fact, it shares a lot of similarities with Just Ducky in terms of story structure, which had just been released the previous year. I just don't really see much of a justification for bringing the story to life, aside from the need to fill a release slot. Not bad, just run-of-the-mill in basically every single way. Possecat. This is your typical Tom and Jerry setup. Tom is told he can't have any food until Jerry is disposed of, only this time this is set in the Old West, and the human owner in question actually keeps trying to shoot at him every time he fails. Everything about this is perfectly fine, even if it takes from so many other cartoons like Texas Tom and, to a lesser extent, The Lonesome Mouse, which, by this point, seems inevitable. A well-done execution of the final gag does help it a bit, but I also can't in good conscience say that this one really stands out in a meaningful way. Drag Along Droopy. Another delight from Avery. Just chock full of Averyisms in a way that we really hadn't seen since before his sabbatical. From the great jokes and set pieces like the shooting contest between Droopy and the wolf, to the lame jokes like the "this means you" gag, to even the subtle details like how the opening crawl says the story was told by a Texan. Get it? Texan, as in Tex Avery. This one just feels so alive and energetic. It turns out if you put Tex Avery out in the Old West for him to play with, good things tend to happen. The Impossible Possum. One of the better Dick Lundy Barney Bear cartoons. If for no other reason, it actually manages to pay attention to things like timing and situations and doesn't lollygag. It moves at a good pace, there's some good gags in here, and Barney feels pretty solid as a character in this one. I kind of wish the possum was a bit more of a defined or well-designed character, because as is, there's not a whole lot to him other than being your typical cartoon rival. If that one detail had been ironed out, this could have had the potential to be Barney Bear's best cartoon. But it's a fine one regardless, with some solid, if unremarkable, laughs. Hiccup Pup. Does snugly follow into the trend of cartoon plots we've seen before, but tweaked just ever so slightly. Which, as I've said before countless times in this review series alone, if you can get the fundamentals down, like good facial expressions, timing, or slapstick, then some repeating can be overlooked, which is what happened here. The thing that makes this one stand out in particular is the ending, where Tom has more or less an unambiguous win, and Jerry actually loses for once, which is admittedly a little forced. I mean, all it took was Tom scaring away their hiccups one time for all to be forgiven. But regardless, it is such a breath of fresh air to see almost any tweak to a well-established formula, even if the setup of it could have been better. And that is the end of Part 3, 75% completion. And so, if you look at this chart, you can see that there was an overall improvement over Part 2, although not as drastic as from Part 1 to Part 2. And I think the name of the game this time was just consistency. While Part 2 still had to deal with some growing pains from the early on cartoons, this time they hit the ground running. It was pretty rare that we got a subpar cartoon during this era. And they were still cranking out some real classics. Tex Avery and Hanna-Barbera were very comfortable and confident in their style and craft by this point, so this outcome isn't terribly surprising. And for those that are curious, here are the ratings separated by quantity, and by total coincidence, the amount of 10 out of 10s in parts 2 and 3 were exactly the same, 12 each. But yeah, it seems that MGM was perfectly content at just letting those three directors in particular go wild. No need to mess with what's working, I always say. But of course, the good times were not going to last forever, and we are fast approaching the end. And now that Part 3 has officially been put to bed, we can now continue on to the final part, Part 4. And the question on everyone's mind is, can Part 4 possibly be an improvement over Part 3?
You serious?
No, that's not happening. But that doesn't mean this isn't going to be interesting. We're going to be reaching the ends of the Tex Avery and Hanna-Barbera era, and then working our way to both the Gene Deitch and Chuck Jones directed Tom and Jerry cartoons, with Chuck Jones finally migrating over to MGM after his firing over at Warner Brothers. Boy, that seemed to happen a lot, didn't it? There likely won't be as many classics next time, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be worth going over. And who knows, maybe there will be a few hidden gems tucked away in here that deserve more recognition. There's only one way to know for sure. And I guess that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. And once again, a special thank you to all of my beautiful patrons. You guys are amazing. And if you want to be notified of when Part 4 comes out, make sure that you're subscribed so that you don't miss it. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.